So good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Center for Creative Writing and Translation at Sai University, I'm happy to welcome Rayji de Guia. I'm Srilata, a poet, writer, and academic, also the director of CCWT at Sai University. This center is part of, as part of its activities, has actually conducted workshops, talks by poets, writers, and translators, including Fiona Bolger, Antanem, Thomas Hitoshi, Prikshma, Nandini Krishnan, and now, of course, we have Rayji. Some of these have been done in partnership with the Chennai Mathematical Institute, and some of these events are like standalone events. This is more by way of a standalone event, but as it happens, Rayji is a writer in residence at the Chennai Mathematical Institute. And there's a story to that residency itself. It's in partnership with Sangam House, so really happy to have you here, Rayji. And for those of you who are joining us, just a little note, all our recordings of all the events conducted so far are up on our webpage. I'll share the link with you shortly. Welcome to all of you, audience, and thank you for being here today. Brief introduction about Rayji. She's a fiction writer, a poet, and illustrator. Her work can be found in Asian Cha, the Deadlands, Harana Poetry, The Pinch, and in a variety of different journals. And I think she also has a website. I'll try and share the link with you in the chat box as well. Rayji is a widely awarded poet. I mean, she's received awards both for her fiction as well as for poetry. Currently, as I said, she is the writer in residence at the Chennai Mathematical Institute. She's working on her first book of short stories, Provincia y Dolorosa. I hope I've said that correctly. Currently, she is an instructor at the University of the Philippines at Diliman. Our conversation today will revolve around writing in English as a Filipino and what it means in terms of its being a post-colonial condition and so on. Rayji has always wrestled with the tension that is, I think, would be familiar to us as well. The tension of sort of rendering the multilingual facets of Filipino womanhood into neo-colonial dominant language in all her work, both in her fiction as well as in her poetry. As part of today's conversation, she will be reading to us pieces from her writing that exhibit this wide multilingual transnational poetics. And she'll also be talking about her practice. So it's something I'm really looking forward to listening to. I'm just going to be anchoring this. So I will not be saying very much, maybe just a few questions, and then we will get it started as a conversation. And I think then it will be really Rayji's show. So welcome once again, Rayji. It's really, really a pleasure to have you here with us. Thank you. And the reason we made this online, as I was explaining to Rayji, is so we could actually have more of you participating, because not everyone can make it physically to Sai University. So thank you all again. You work both as a fiction writer and you also work as a poet. You've worked with both forms. So let me start by asking you this very obvious question. Tell me about your relationship with these two forms. Do you maybe have a slight preference for one over the other? How does that work? How do you switch between one and the other? What happens if you do that?
So I'm primarily a fiction writer. It's something I always tell people, but somehow they don't believe me. But yes, I'm primarily a fiction writer. I started writing poetry around 2008. Before that, I was mainly doing fiction. Poetry is something more personal for me, I guess. When I was starting out with poetry, I was mostly playing with language. I was playing with the sound and like the form and such. And then until my professor pointed out that I don't write about my emotions. And I felt challenged to because that accusation. So I was like, okay, maybe I should try that. And so poetry became a personal thing for me, as opposed to my fiction, which is also, quite emotional. But I bury it under layers and layers of things of fiction. But in poetry, I think I much prefer it when channeling my personal feelings and experiences, and also So before the pandemic, I didn't know I had ADHD, but it was severely impacting my writing in ways I didn't realize until now. I couldn't write fiction anymore. And so I turned to poetry, the only thing I could write, because I think for me, I'm not sure for other people, but for me, fiction and poetry require different mindsets. And I couldn't sustain the focus necessary for writing long stories anymore. I write short stories, but they tend to be on the longer side. So, and I couldn't sustain the energy and focus anymore. And so I was writing poetry nonstop in 2019. Um, I was writing like one poem every week, every few weeks. I had a new poem, and so um, now that I'm treated for ADHD, I returned to fiction in order to finish my short story collection. So I think fiction requires more sustained and focused on energy over the course of like days, weeks when writing it. Whereas in my experience, poetry is more about the burst of energy. And I used to revise a single poem 5 times in a day, and it would be like entirely different from the first draft until like the final. And so which is to say, in terms of preference, like I think I would say I prefer writing fiction, but at the moment I switching between one or the other, it's difficult. And I'm working on a short story collection, and I do miss writing poetry, but I feel like if I switch to poetry, it will be difficult to switch back to fiction. And right now I prefer writing fiction, but I do love teaching poetry. I love analyzing poetry. So there.
So do you ever panic that, when you're working with one form, you're not going to be able to go back to the other form? Just curious, does that happen?
Yes, actually, because I kind of like stopped writing poetry in 2020. And since then until now, I've written like maybe 2 poems. I've written 2 poems, 2 or 3 poems since 2020. But I've written like so many words of fiction. So in a way I was worried, like, am I gonna go back to poetry? And I think I will. I just really need to finish this book, and then I will be free to work on the poetry collection after.
Right. Okay. So when did you first begin to realize that you were maybe a writer? What brought you to writing? Tell us a little bit about that journey. I mean, I do know from my conversations with you that you were studying to be an architect at one point, but that you then switched to a course in creative writing, right? So could you just tell us a little bit about that?
So yeah, actually it's like a long journey for me, I think. Because my household is not a reading household. We didn't have a lot of books. And so I didn't have like a lot of opportunity to realize until my father brought home a book that was like unclaimed from his company's giveaway promotion. And I started reading it, and it was my first encounter with literature, like as literature. And I was so enamored by it that I wanted to do something like it too. I say it was my first encounter with literature because in high school I didn't know Philippine literature existed. I was studying outside like Manila. I was outside like the capital, and I was like living in like the province rural areas, and like we moved a lot. But in high school in the Philippines, we were required to read one classic Philippine literature each year, but it didn't register to me they were Philippine literature because they were diluted in textbook format. Like it's not the original text. They were kind of like made into like textbooks and diluted to fit like exercises like for high school students and figuring out the moral lesson per chapter, kind of like that. And so that so my first encounter with like an actual book was that, and and it was written in English. So I was having a crisis at like 15 years old or something, that if I were to write a book, who would be my audience? Kind of like that. And then, so when it came to choosing my college program, I went for architecture because I had a talent for drawing. And I was pretty good with trigonometry and like calculus and stuff. So it kind of makes sense. I will go to architecture. But I got really depressed in architecture, and the only thing I kept doing was just, I kept writing. They were really terrible, but I kept writing. I couldn't stop writing. And I found out that in my university, there was a creative writing program, but shifting would mean I would be wasting like 3 or so years in architecture. And it was a very like expensive course because like every week you need new art materials and stuff. And so I was afraid that I would of like, wasting all those years. And like I felt guilty about wasting all those years because we were very poor at that time. And I was afraid like because architecture kind of like made me hate drawing, made me hate like doing art. And I was afraid that if I would study creative writing, I would hate it the same way. I wasn't even good at writing at that time. I was really very horrible. So I was thinking, do I even have like a kind of future here? Because it didn't come naturally to me as writing, as drawing did. So I was actually very suicidal at that time. And what really kept me alive was like, I had this impossible, at that time, I thought it was very impossible, this dream that I would publish a book. And actually, at that time, I was thinking I would publish a novel, but right now I'm working on a short story collection. But my past self didn't know that like the nuances of that. It's a book. And so it took me 2 tries. I went like 2 years to be able to get into creative writing. And I still struggled very much in creative writing, but I never really stopped writing. And so 10 years since I actually like went into creative writing, 10 years since, and I'm very certain that it's impossible for me to stop writing. So
Yeah, and I was just thinking as you were talking that perhaps, your years as a student of architecture were not entirely a waste, because maybe there are some lessons about, building novels and building fiction, building the structures of fiction that you learn as an architect. I mean, it's also, there's a certain design element, I think, in composing writing as well. So I was wondering if, that didn't carry through into your writing life a little bit, at least.
Oh, very much. I was very focused on space, and that translated into setting. And so I was very much paying attention to the setting of my short stories. And so when I write, it's just the way like my characters interact with setting. Like it's very important to me because it's the setting that dictates the kind of behavior my characters would have and the kind of culture that they're steeped in. And so for me, like describing the setting, it's like I actually have like an architecture book next to me right now. It's like it's the visual dictionary of like Filipino architecture. And then I use this as like reference for my setting. And so like yes, very much I think like looking back, I don't think I would be the writer I am now without my years in architecture.
Right. I don't think writing works in those silos anyway. So it's kind of nice to think about these connections, I think, for all of us. No? Yeah. So thank you. So I was also, I just wanted to quote a few lines from your wonderful story that you shared with me, Assumption, it's called. And you write in that story, I'm just weaving in a little quote here. You know that your brain is too shaken for difficult courses in college. In high school, you hate English because it's weird in your mouth. You hate Filipino because it's too complicated compared to the Tagalog you speak. And you hate Spanish because it reminds you of the time your mother, a devout woman of the Lord, but too choleric for convent, dragged you to a house in Ternate to demand payment for a massive debt incurred at Tindahan. Against the onslaught of Chavacano and threats of Valis Tambo, she pulled you to her side, and from her bayong, a rust-damaged itak, you forget what happened next. Still, you connived with your Ternateno classmate. In whispers, you translate the English sentences in your exam to Tagalog, and he translates it back to you in Spanish. You survive your classes this way. Yeah. So this is a quote, and I'm sorry I butchered the words. But I was just looking at this, and I was thinking, about your relationship with languages, with language itself, with English, which is the language in which you write, as well as all of the other languages you sort of travel between. So how does that really impact your work? And I know you have a lot to say about this, but how does this whole essential sort of post-coloniality of writing in English, but the fact that it's in a sense now, non-negotiable for us, you do it, and that's who you are, right? How does it impact your work? How does the tension of that actually seep into your work? So that was kind of like my question.
Right next door to us, we have this town where speak a Spanish, and how that the kind of Tagalog, which is my mother tongue, that I knew is also influenced by that, as well as the other places that we moved in. So my tone as someone outside Manila is very apparent when I speak with my family, but and so I am, my proximity to the English language is more of something that is acquired in school, because we had this colonial remnant from the American colonial times called English policy, where we pay 5 pesos if we're caught per English word, per non-English word that we're caught saying. So that's 5 pesos. And at that time, my allowance was 20 pesos per day, which would mean I only had 4 words before I ran out of money, right? So English for me, for my child mind and literature, it was not for family or for friends. And so when I went to university, that's the first time I encountered rich people, and because they were rich people, they had more access to Western culture and Western media, etc. And so their proximity with the English language is something that, it's something that for them is something they grew up with. So they do speak it, and their access to the English language was made possible because of their financial status. We call them Englishero, and I met a large number of them when I shifted into the creative writing program. And in order to fit in, I had to lose my accent very fast when I speak English, and to learn and communicate English, in a casual manner, as if it came naturally to me, because they make fun of you more if you try too hard with your English, you're very obviously not a speaker, whatever. So I needed to assimilate. At the same time, Filipino for me was quite different from the Tagalog I knew, even though Tagalog was the basis of Filipino, because it's a more standardized version. And moving around in the province, I also knew that Tagalog had many dialects that, made it a bit more distinct with each other. So for example, Batanggenyo Tagalog is much, much different than my Tagalog I'm familiar with. And the Tagalog in my hometown, like I said, borrows from Chavacano, from Ternate next town. So the Englisheras that I encountered, my first encounter with Philippine lit in English made me train English, tend to be monolingual English. It didn't sound Filipino, even though it claims to be Filipino, right? Because it's written in monolingual English and are usually about, people who live in Manila and people who live their upper middle class lives. And I felt alienated reading it. So before I was even conscious of doing it, I was struggling against monolingualism in my work about Filipino women in the rural. So I wanted to capture that post-coloniality, that tension relationship I have with the English language in my own writing, and to capture my voice, right? In Philippine English, and Philippine English is quite different from the the American or like British English. So Philippine English, as I hear it from my own voice, from my mother's voice, from my sisters, my aunties, my grandma's voice, and those have surrounded me growing up. So I think this is missing in Philippine literature in English because given the background that I have, I was like I grew up poor outside Manila, and it's it's not very common for someone like me to be a writer. But so yeah, sorry, I have a lot to say about this. And I
Please go on. It's really fascinating. I think it really speaks to those of us here who struggle with pretty much the same questions, about the language in which we write, which isn't your mother tongue, and which, I think we work with the same sort of tensions. And also this idea of who qualifies to be a writer, right? Sometimes you feel you're not quite a writer because what is this language you're writing in is, are you even fluent in it? You wonder sometimes. I think we're working with the same thing. So please, I find it absolutely fascinating what you're saying.
Yeah. I actually first saw the possibility of what I wanted to do in my work. Like when I read the poetry of Isabella Manzon, who became later on my poetry professor. So her poem is called Lola Coqueta. It's the title of the whole collection. And the poem itself, it captures the voice of an old woman telling a story to her granddaughter and imitating her own voice in the past and the voice of like her of someone else like a Don Manuel in the past and such. And it incorporated Spanish and Filipino into an English poem and made use of like non-standard syntax. And I could hear the voice of like the typical Filipino grandmother in that poem. Like Lola means grandmother for us. And I described this poem at that time, a musty poem, like quote unquote musty. And because it kind of reminds me of my grandma's house, like mustiness, like all the mothballs and the dust. And I've been chasing this mustiness in my writing since then. But at that time I couldn't explain what mustiness actually is. Until like I was in Bangalore, I was a resident at Sangam House. And in a conversation with another writer, Alison, I was able to connect mustiness with translation. She was talking about how her favorite kinds of translations are the ones that are like not really smooth, but like what she said was like kind of trips in your tongue or something. And I was like, oh, my friends and I call that a texture of language. And I personally call it mustiness. And then that's what, and I had like an epiphany right there in 2019, November, about mustiness and translation. And so mustiness became my multilingual translational poetics. And I actively disrupt the English language in order to approximate a more authentic Filipino voice in English. My primary audience is always Filipino, even though I write in English. And that's why, like, I don't want to alienate them the same way I was alienated by Philippine literature in English. And others who understand English can still read my work, but their experience of my work is different. They are overhearing my work, so I make use of the overheard. And I believe that meaning can be derived in other ways than just understanding exactly the word. Your experience with a word that you don't understand is just as significant and meaningful. So yes, that's what.
Yeah, I love that what you said about making use of what you overhear, and putting all those voices in there and not sort of shying away from it or not, working through that awkwardness of it and saying, yeah, this is who we are. And I think that's so much a part of the work that many of us do as writers. So this kind of, I was also struck by the kind of the specificity of what how gender and sexuality sort of play out in your writing. You also already said something about how being a Filipino woman writer is different from being maybe just another kind of writer who writes from within a very monolingual space. But can you tell us a little bit about the role that gender and sexuality specifically play out, how they play out in your writing, and can you say something about that? And also, how if you have any thoughts, I think this is something I've sort of learned to ask of almost every woman writer that I meet. Do you have any specific thoughts on the shaping of the literary canon and on being a woman writer, especially in the context that you're writing from?
So aside from the that I actually write about women and that I construct my writing always to be about women. Being a Filipino woman writer, I think gave me like the awareness of my specificity, and I think that's a benefit. Like I do not have any delusions of like universality, and I do not aspire to be universal because it often means subscribing to like the dominant mode, which is masculine and like Western and such. So I always locate my work in how I am a bisexual Filipino woman who grew up poor outside Manila, and I write stories whose setting allows various women to exist in that setting, in that specific milieu. And this also comes with the awareness, I think, that there are other specificities that I don't or can't cover. I believe that it is through locating yourself that allows the humanity in your work to shine through. That it feels more human the more specific you are in your writing. And it is because of that process that it manages to resonate with readers who are unfamiliar with the culture I write from. Regarding like the shaping of the literary canon, and being a woman writer, my thoughts on that is like discomfort. Right? I know I have had my own brushes with like the literary establishments and all that. The thing is, as an undergraduate creative writing student previously, our classes tend to have more women students. Disproportionately, the people in the like literary establishments in the Philippines are old men. The editors, the workshop panelists, the award judges. Like I participated in a writing workshop, an LGBTQ writing workshop, where I and another woman I already know we're the sole women fellows. Like she's already my friend, and turns out it's just us in that like lineup. And when I criticized this, I was told that certain standards have to be met. And I have to question how men, even gay men, uphold this quote unquote standards, and how those standards tend to favor a more masculine voice. For example, plain uncreative prose mistaken for clean and smooth writing, or careless depiction of sensitive topics mistaken as brave attempt at gray morality, right? And it's frustrating. And even some women who are in position in the rare women who are in the literary establishments tend to do the same thing, just perpetuate the same thing. And the same people control like the shaping of like the literary landscape and like the canon. And so another specific thing that I will say that I'm part of like the first lesbian anthology in the Philippines, and it took literal years for it to be completed by the editor. I was invited to submit like in 2019, and like the publication happened in like 2021, if I remember correctly. Yes, 2021. And it was picked up by a known Filipino publisher, but contributors were only paid in like copies. Like we were and like restrictive contract, and like some contributors didn't even get like their copy up until now. And the print run was very low. And like it's very common for like Philippine publications to have low print run. But the thing is, the demand for this book is very obvious. And there were like ebooks available. And so people like resort to buying the ebooks, even though they want to get a copy of this first lesbian anthology. And it has been nominated for like the National Book Award recently, but no news about any second print run so far. And this is how like queer women writers trying to like make space are being treated, and like, you know, women in general. Right? Like there is no lack of like women writers, but we are not given like any sort of safe space so far.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I think that's kind of how it works here as well. That most people who gravitate towards writing or towards literature happen to be women, but then you don't know where they disappear when it comes to anthologies and books.
Yeah.
And, you know, the whole publishing scenario. I mean, it's changing, but really very slowly. Yes, thank you for that. Yeah. So before I actually request you to read to us from your poems, I just thought, because we do have a lot of young writers, I think, today with us. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about, you know, do you have any writing rituals that you have daily? Do you write to set hours? How do you navigate the space of work, professional work, you know, also being a student and also writing and all of that? How have you done it all these years?
So before, I used to just run on the fumes of like my untreated ADHD, but now I really do have to set time to be able to write. And one advice I was given by my poetry professor when she found out that I'm now teaching, is to fight for my time to write. So I still struggle with this. Like, but during my stay here as like the writer in residence, like, because I'm teaching online too, like I have students back in the Philippines. Um, I would dedicate like half of my day to work, either like before lunch or after lunch, and then write during the other half. There are times, depending on like my workload and like teaching schedule, there are times that I would have to divide my week instead. So I have like 3 days for work, and then the other days I dedicate to writing. I also have like, there are times like I want to just keep writing and writing and writing, but I have to stop myself, because I also realize that, you know, writing is still labor. And if you just keep writing and then you have no more energy, you will not be able to write until you fully recover. And so, you know, I had to learn that the hard way. Actually. Like when I was younger, like I was just like hyper focused on writing. I would write a whole short story in like less than a week, and like I would not sleep. I would not like, don't do that. It's not healthy, and it's not sustainable. So yeah, what I need when I'm writing now is like, you know, I always have like a tumbler next to me, like, and snacks, because, you know, if I have to get up and drink water, I get distracted very easily. So it's, you know, working with like, you know, like what works for you. I also make sure I have all the reference books next to me. Like I have like a lot of books here next to me, and I have a lumbar seat support because I'm in my 30s now. um, Whenever I'm working on a new story or like a new poem, I need to be able to figure out that first sentence, like the perfect first sentence, the perfect first line. And that's like, I think that's the only like ritual like thing I have to like, you know, I really need to set that down before I can begin to write anything, because it's my gateway into that first draft. Like if I don't have like that first line, it's difficult for me to like grasp like what I'm writing about. Like that first line needs to frame my whole manuscript. And so like, yes.
Yeah, thank you. So, yeah, so before we sort of, you know, before I run away with myself, I was wondering if you would read to us from your work. I mean, you can pick from your fiction or your poetry, whatever you prefer. If you want to write, like read from your work in progress, that's good too. Yeah.
So I will read first this poem called Mangkukulam. I wrote this at Sangam House. Just a bit of context, like Mangkukulam is our word for like a witch, kind of a witch, and who makes kulam. Kulam means curse. So I am gonna read it now. Mangkukulam. How did it come to this? To hit a nerve that wound as shallow as it is must be vindictive. A glaring eye above your ankle that pulls hatred at your muscles every night because a needle half a year ago grazed your skin, and so it stays undeserved. But you must think, is it worse than knowing for 25 years you were unloved by your husband who sought women the same age as your marriage? Hulang, a healer told you. An insect resides there, the mark of the bruja, round with ridges, a black sun within. Left not by your estranged husband, but his woman who seek to know who he seeks when he is away. It is not you, I know, but does it matter that it's not you? Not to me, not to my patron. There is no end to this. You are cursed under my influence. This wound is my success. How it swells in the cold, how pus oozes whenever doctors come to play fools. In Hindi, there is a word kolam by women, rice flour poured on the ground in beautiful lines and knots and shapes for prosperity. I suppose I corrupted their tradition with you as the pavement, carving your skin the same pattern again and again for the demand of another who shares with me her good fortune. We remain to be women who seek to counter our fate. So how did it come to this? You innocent, she ignorant, and I powerful. This is not even difficult. Okay, so the next poem is a retelling of Medusa. I incorporate this is like very much aggressively multilingual. So it's called Greek chorus. Here's Medusa doing Zumba. Um, did you hear, mga dear? Medusa attends Zumba na, left misfit, a misfit did slipping through the fit of her slip. And di wow, easier daw, kasi she's well endowed with the highbrow know-how. Olga, that Iha goes to yoga without a toga. Gaga, amiga, she doesn't have a bra. I mean, is it decente to be that campante? I hear she speaks. She a snake? Putek, let me speak. She sneaks, snacks. Ah, puta, I forgot it. Mga best, did you hear Medusa has snakes on her chin and has snakes on her neck and under her chin? Dai maring kiray, she cries when she tries to raise her thighs every Muay Thai aray. I Perseus, I'm sure would have issues. Oh, Perseus, he's got a tight fit, Coach Perseus. So courteous, but pero medyo bastos. His abs, her flaps, not bagay, it's sad. I know it's crass to make chismes in class. It's just when you look into the glass. And then I will read, so this one is from the Assumption. So the same short story that Sri Lanka read from. And it is at a time when the main character is starting to split because of how much she has endured. And so the usage of the pronoun becomes we, so it's you and then we. And so she's starting to split, not into two because of trauma and as such. So this is from the Assumption. You're failing as a mother because you're still figuring out how to be a wife. We recall our mother, this cycle that we're in. How did it come to this? The company forces Jerry to retire when our children are in elementary school, a private one, even though it's not easy. We hold onto his retirement fund through argument after argument, you failing as a wife as we attempt to be a mother. Pero dapat lang, di ba? You're unable to dissuade him from investing into a farm in Candelaria, the funds Beck saved when she was a domestic helper abroad. He doesn't listen when we show him our computations on the weekends that he's home, the corns that didn't fully grow, the eggplants and tomatoes, the optimistic estimate still resulting in negative. And when you let slip our suspicion that his kasama is swindling him, he yells at us with the impact of our father's beating. We save some bills in medicine boxes in the refrigerator, the ones for our children's frequent coughs and allergies, bills sewn in pockets of our underwear, bills under the broken tile in the kitchen. He accuses us of hiding his money, which we do. We have to. Our body is coming apart, our toenails rotting, soaked in soapy water for hours every day as we wash our children's uniforms and the clothes Jerry brings home on Saturdays. The skin between our toes are so irritated we have to request our neighbors to pick our children up from school along with her for 2 weeks because we can't walk too long and our hands wounded from scrubbing Jerry's collar too hard when you find the faintest stain of a lipstick. You get paranoid whenever he comes home sniffing his clothes for any unfamiliar scent. The weekend after a huge fight, he brings home stick-o for the children and buko pie for you. Our stress grows so insurmountable that as Lorena and Gerard play in the sala until one or the other wails, you scold them, realizing only when we're met with the fear you cause to appear on their faces. By this time, guilt is all you know. When you make Lorena cry because you didn't catch your own frustration after she ate her brother's fried eggs for breakfast, the pantry carefully rationed for each month. When we find Gerard groaning in pain inside his cabinet curled over his clothes because he ate the spoiled rice you intended to throw out. You can you bury yourself into more chores, into more tocino you can sell to other mothers at the school parking lot as guilt gnaws on you inside out. You get so tired that by dinner time you doze off when Lorena wants to show us her drawings or when Gerard wants to tell us about a basketball game he played with his friends. To make up for the lost time, you bond with them with the rosary before bed, but by then they're the ones asleep. Despite the tight budget, we set aside funds to get them new panties and briefs before school begins every year. We're well aware that this is not enough. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rayji. That was wonderful. I'll now, I think, open this up for questions, comments from the audience. And I've also put two little things in the chat box. One is I think Rayji's web page, so you can look her up. She's also an illustrator, so she's like, yeah, she's done a number of things. So you can sort of look it up, and also the web page of CCWT, so you can check that out when you have the time. But if you have questions or comments, you can either unmute yourselves and ask, or you can type it up in the chat box.
I'd just like to say a huge thank you. It was really interesting, Rayji. There were a couple of things in your talk which I found really, really fascinating. I'm not sure if I misheard you, but I think you said that you write primarily for your Filipino audience. So I thought that was really interesting, that you thought that other English speakers are overhearing your work. And that just really resonated. It made a huge amount of sense. I think that's exactly what I would feel when I write. Sometimes I write poems using Tamil and English words, and it's Tamil and Hindi words. And it's kind of, people say, oh, but you should explain the word, or you should put it in English. And it's like, no, this is who it's for. And it's funny when you then read those poems for the people for whom they've been written, and you see the poem land, you recognize that there's maybe a small number of people that you're writing to and for, and everybody else is just overhearing. And I think I loved what you said then. And I think that's connected to what you said about, the specificity is what gives the poems their power. And for me, it's kind of like the specificity of a poem gives it its universality. The universality is kind of this generalized kind of blah kind of thing, whereas the specificity, the actual color of your flesh and blood, the genetic, the kind of the DNA of the poet in it gives it a sense of, being available to other people in a real way rather than just some generic thing. I'd one question for you. When you said about the canon, you mentioned that Filipino, the presence of Filipino women within the canon, and I wasn't quite sure as well. My reception is such that I can't hear properly, but I wondered, would you have something to say about a specific moment in the history of the Philippines that would have seen a lot of women writers being included in the canon, or a certain moment where women writers were excluded? And I speak as an Irish woman, where I've seen moments when, pre-1922, which was the foundation of the Irish Free State, when the British were finally kind of pushed out of 26 counties. At that point, Irish women suddenly anthologies were put together with no women in them. And previously there had been like, maybe 1/3 women in anthologies, and suddenly these anthologies were being put together and there were no women. And those women that dropped out then, future anthology makers never found those women again. They got lost. And now we're trying to refine them. So I just wondered, was there a similar defining moment, or where women suddenly appeared in the Filipino canon or suddenly disappeared? I'm really interested in the historical kind of context of women writing in the Philippines. And thank you so much. It was just so interesting to hear you today, and really for your generosity in sharing your experience with us.
Thank you for appreciating what I have to say. Regarding a similar history, I wouldn't say like the way patriarchy works in the Philippine context is kind of different. And I guess because the thing is, the exclusion is kind of more in the production, I would feel. It's not that there was a lack of women. I think, although I mean, in comparison to like the men, it's still lacking in a way, but it's not. I don't think there was ever a point that they were absent, because the first short story in English was written by a woman. It was called Dead Stars by Paz Marquez Benitez. So what I'm seeing now is that it's like the problem is in the production, in the institutions, and like getting the approval, the male approval, in order to be part of the canon, right? It's quite different. That the exclusion, I think, is a bit different, because in like I said, like it's not that like women were super absent. It's in the establishments, in like as editors, as like as publishers and judges even. But it's not like they were absent. So I can't really pinpoint like any point in history, because like I said, like women writers have been there, like in the history of Philippine literature in English at the very least. They've always been there at the beginning, and I can trace back like Philippine literature in English is quite young actually, and it's more during the colonial times. I think that's when it was a bit more difficult for women to really publish. But there have been some women. There's Florentino, Leona Florentino is Spanish colonial writer, poet, and people speculate that she's a lesbian, and it's likely that she was a lesbian. So, but some people claim that she's just writing commissions, kind of like Sappho. People discredit that. So it was during like the Spanish colonial times that I would say that women were very absent in the like intellectual activity, the literary activity, in the history of like.
Any other comments or questions? Right. Thank you. Then, Rayji, thank you so much for a wonderfully engaged, thoughtful talk, conversation, whatever. And and we'll keep you posted on. Yeah, sorry, Fiona, did you have another?
Just one more thing. I didn't manage to catch all of the names because the names are unfamiliar to me. So I think you mentioned your first teacher and that poem that you had in your head with the grandmother's voice and all of that. And you just mentioned the first woman in first writer was a woman. Those kind of names, if you don't mind just putting together a little bibliography and sending it through Srilata to the rest of us who didn't manage to catch all of those names, that would be fabulous. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So any quick comments or questions? Does anybody else have anything? Yeah. Thank you.
I would just
yes. Yes.
Sorry, I almost forgot. The concept of the overheard, I would just like to give a source on it. Was I read about the concept of the overheard because a Filipino scholar was looking into like how Filipino writers write in English. And if I remember correctly, it was done, the concept of the overheard was being applied on biblical translations. So it was Phyllis Bird who was talking about it, and how she was, Phyllis Bird was talking about how translating the Bible for the modern readers shouldn't have, like, they're not obligated to make the modern reader understand the Bible 100%, kind of like that. So I just wanted to, in case like it's not my own concept, but I read it somewhere. That's all. That's all. Sorry.
But if I can just say one thing, I don't know, we women, we always attribute ideas that we borrowed from somewhere. And, you know, we always give that kind of, this is where I got it from. And I find myself doing exactly the same thing. I don't know if it's a gendered thing, but I hear you. And thank you so much for giving us that citation. I have heard, yeah, thank you. Thank you.